This is the front line of a global power struggle. A tiny, rusting ship, deliberately grounded on a remote reef, has become the epicenter of a standoff that could drag the world into a major conflict. The sounds are intense, blaring horns, shouted warnings, and the concussive blast of water cannons. This isn't a history lesson. This is happening right now. This isn't just a regional dispute. It's a global test. The world's response will define the future of international order. Ignoring this flashpoint risks emboldening further aggression elsewhere. The principles of sovereignty and peaceful resolution are at stake. How nations react here will set a precedent for decades to come. It's a moment of truth for collective security. The world must now decide if it will uphold its stated values. Passivity could lead to a dangerous new era. Vigilance and unity are paramount to avert catastrophe. A small crew of Filipino Marines is being systematically cut off by the Coast Guard of a superpower. And what happens right here, in these contested waters, could trigger a global economic crisis and a war that pulls in the world's biggest military powers. This is the standoff in the South China Sea, and you need to know why it matters. Section 1. The Tinderbox, a rusty ship and a red line. So, how did we get to this point? It all comes back to the ship. It's called the BRP Sierra Madre, a World War II-era vessel that's basically a ghost from another time. Back in 1999, the Philippine Navy intentionally ran it aground on a reef called the Second Thomas Shoal. It's been there ever since, a rusted-out, skeletal, but incredibly powerful symbol. It serves as a de facto military outpost where a handful of Filipino Marines live in squalid conditions. A lonely human flag planted in a vast sea with just one mission: physically hold this spot to show it belongs to the Philippines. But for China, which also claims this reef, the Sierra Madre is an eyesore and an obstacle to be removed. So for years it's been trying to squeeze the Philippines out. Not with missiles or an invasion, but with a slow, grinding campaign of intimidation. A death by 1,000 cuts. This is what's known as grayzone warfare, actions that are aggressive and coercive, but are designed to stay just below the threshold of an act of war. This plays out in a dangerous cat-and-mouse game every few weeks. Small Philippine supply boats, often just civilian vessels, head out to deliver food, water, and essentials to the Marines. And every single time, they are met by a flotilla of the China Coast Guard and its maritime militia. These aren't just patrol boats. They're huge, intimidating ships that dwarf the Filipino vessels. The encounters have become more and more violent. Chinese ships have rammed the smaller supply boats, causing serious damage. They use high-pressure water cannons that are powerful enough to shatter glass and injure crew members. They've aimed military-grade lasers to temporarily blind sailors and used acoustic devices to disorient them. In one of the most alarming escalations, Chinese Coast Guard personnel rammed and boarded Philippine inflatable boats, brandishing knives, seizing equipment, and puncturing the vessels. A Filipino sailor lost his thumb in the chaos. This isn't just random bullying. It's a calculated strategy. By blocking repairs and resupply, China hopes the Sierra Madre will literally collapse into the sea, or that the Philippines will finally give up. If that happens, China can take control of the Second Thomas Shoal without firing a single shot, tightening its grip on one of the most strategic waterways on Earth. But what gives China the idea that it can claim territory hundreds of miles from its own coast, right on its neighbor's doorstep? The answer lies in a few dashes drawn on a map decades ago. Section 2. The fuel, the 9-dash lie. When you zoom out from this one reef, you see the staggering scale of China's ambition. This is the South China Sea, a massive stretch of water between Singapore and Taiwan, and on its official maps, China claims almost all of it. This claim is shown by the 9-dash line, a vague U-shaped perimeter that swallows up nearly 90% of the sea. This line slices right through the internationally recognized maritime zones of 5 other countries: the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. The conflict here boils down to China's historical claims versus modern international law. Since 1982, the world's oceans have been governed by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. China signed and ratified this treaty. It's the Constitution for the Oceans. UNCLOS is pretty clear. A country controls the waters 12 nautical miles from its coast. Beyond that, it has an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, extending 200 nautical miles, giving it the sole right to all the resources: the fish, the oil, the gas. The second Thomas Shoal, where the Sierra Madre sits, is just over 100 nautical miles from the Philippine island of Palawan, putting it squarely inside the Philippines' EEZ. Seeing this contradiction, the Philippines did something incredible. In 2013, it took China to court, filing a case with the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. China refused to even show up, claiming the tribunal had no jurisdiction, but the case went on. In 2016, the tribunal delivered a sweeping and crystal-clear ruling. It was a huge legal victory for the Philippines. The court declared that China's historic rights claim, the basis for the nine-dash line, had no legal foundation. It ruled that China had violated the Philippines' sovereign rights, and it specifically said that the second Thomas Shoal belongs to the Philippines' EEZ. The ruling was final and legally binding. China's response? Total defiance. It called the ruling a piece of waste paper and has ignored it ever since. It continues to build and militarize artificial islands, harass foreign vessels, and act as if the ruling never happened. The Philippines, for its part, has recently doubled down, making the 2016 ruling a cornerstone of its foreign policy and public statements, reducing the space for a diplomatic compromise. This is the heart of the conflict, a standoff between a world based on rules and one where a superpower believes its might makes right. Section 3. The Global Fire, Why Your Wallet Should Be Worried. So, why should a fight over some remote rocks matter to you, whether you're in North America, Europe, or Africa? Because the South China Sea isn't just water, it's the planet's most critical economic artery. A mind-boggling amount of global trade flows through these waters, somewhere between $3.4 and $5.3 trillion worth every year. That's about a third of all global maritime shipping. Think about what's on those ships. Nearly half of the world's crude oil shipments, a huge chunk of its natural gas, and over a quarter of its automotive trade. The phone in your hand, the clothes you're wearing, the car you drive, chances are some or all of it floated through the South China Sea. When this flow is threatened, the entire global economy shudders. And it is being threatened, not just by a potential war, but by the constant gray zone conflict happening now. Every time a water cannon is fired or a ship is rammed, it sends a tremor of risk through the global shipping industry. This rising tension has increased risk perception, and there are signs it's starting to affect insurance costs for vessels in the region. Companies are looking at backup routes, but those are much longer and way more expensive. Rerouting just one voyage can add up to $1 million in costs. Those costs don't just vanish. They get passed down the supply chain, from the shipper to the store, and finally to you. We've seen this before. The shipping disruptions in the Red Sea added nearly a full percentage point to global goods inflation. A major crisis in the South China Sea, a waterway with many times the traffic of the Red Sea, would have a catastrophic economic impact. A full blockade could spark a global recession. One study projected that if shipping stopped entirely, the economies of trading nations like Taiwan and Singapore would shrink by a third and a quarter. Even China's own massive economy would be crippled. The fragile supply chains we all depend on would snap, leading to shortages, price hikes, and economic chaos on a scale we haven't seen in generations. This standoff isn't some distant problem. It's a direct threat to the global economy. CTA. This tangled web of military, legal, and economic pressure is creating a dangerous feedback loop. To see how the world is responding and how we're all being pulled into this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. Section 4. The Brink, Alliances and Tripwires. As high as the economic stakes are, there's an even bigger danger: a shooting war between major powers. That risk is anchored in a 70-year-old promise, a single document that acts as the ultimate tripwire, the 1951 U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. The treaty is simple. An attack on one is an attack on both. For decades, it was a little vague whether this applied to the scattered islands of the South China Sea. That ambiguity is gone. U.S. officials have now repeatedly and explicitly stated that the treaty covers Philippine armed forces, public vessels, and aircraft, including its Coast Guard, anywhere in the South China Sea. All of a sudden, the actions of the China Coast Guard look infinitely more reckless. Every water cannon blast, every ramming, every act of violence against a Filipino crew brings the world one step closer to the treaty being invoked. If a Filipino service member is killed, would that be considered an armed attack? Washington has affirmed its ironclad commitment, and Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. says he's confident the U.S. would step in. This is the flashpoint that could pull the United States into a direct military fight with China. And the rest of the world isn't just watching anymore. A new web of alliances is forming in response to China's actions. It's not just the U.S. and the Philippines. Japan, which has its own maritime disputes with China, has forged a new trilateral security pact with Washington and Manila. Australia is heavily involved through the Quad, alongside the US, India, and Japan. Even European powers like the UK, France, and Germany are sending their warships thousands of miles from home on freedom of navigation patrols to make a point. The Philippines is no longer playing the victim. It's rapidly modernizing its military, buying new missile systems, and expanding U.S. access to its military bases. China has condemned all of this, accusing the Philippines of playing with fire. What we're seeing is an arms race in slow motion. Both sides are digging in, hardening their positions and drawing red lines, which only increases the chance that a mistake or an accident could spiral out of control. Conclusion, the outlook, a world on watch. We started with a single forgotten ship, a piece of rusting metal stranded on a reef, home to a few Marines. But the BRP Sierra Madre is so much more than that. It's a symbol of national pride. It's a test case for the future of international law, and it's the tripwire for a conflict that could engulf the entire world. The standoff forces us to ask a fundamental question. What kind of world do we want? One governed by rules, where international law is respected by all nations, big and small? Or one where might makes right, where a country can just redraw maps and take what it wants through force? There are no easy answers here. The situation is a volatile stalemate. China's gray zone pressure has failed to push the Philippines out, but it has dramatically raised the risk of a deadly accident. The growing international support for the Philippines has provided a crucial backstop, but it also fuels Beijing's narrative that it's being encircled by outside forces. The standoff could just simmer on, a dangerous game of chicken that constantly threatens to boil over. Diplomacy could, in theory, de-escalate things, but with both sides digging in, the prospects look dim. Or the worst-case scenario could happen. A single mistake, a reckless commander, or a tragic accident triggers a war that nobody wants but nobody can stop. The fate of the global economy and the future of peace itself may well depend on the courage of a few Marines on a forgotten ship, and on whether the rest of the world decides to pay attention before it's too late.